Very moved. So I know we have business at hand, and I don't want to cheat you out of that, especially on my birthday. So, with your permission, I'll pull up our first reading for today and lead us into meditation. But know that as we move into our silence today, for me, it will be one full of gratitude for all of you, and I'll hold you all very close in that. Thank you. All right. So, as always, Benum Christinet, I greet Christ in you. Our opening prayer is one that should be familiar to you, and I'll explain its use a bit later. So let us pray. Our Father in heaven, your name is holy. May your kingdom come. May your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today the bread that sustains us, and forgive us our shortfalls, as we forgive those whose shortfalls offend us. Do not put us to the test, and save us from the evil one. Amen. So our first reading is on page 100 of Contemplating Christ, for those of you who'd like to follow in the book. Yet the overt and blundering destruction left in the wake of these renegades pales in comparison to those more lethal still, who have honed the skill of coexistence with us. Of course, here we're talking about the different demons, right? Like clever little parasites, they make their home in us, comfortably existing alongside our virtues and cunning enough to leave us in stasis. Their aim is not that we should self-destruct, but something far more insidious, that we should become ordinary, that we should be neutralized or worse, co-opted in service of the powers of this present darkness. Better that we should remain complacent in the face of our hypocrisies and the world's injustices. Better that we should find ourselves just comfortable enough to lack the motivation to challenge the status quo of our interior lives, the state of the world, or the plight of others. Amen. So our second reading this morning spans from 100 to 101. The last thing a parasitic demon wants is for us to engage in any real self-examination that might spark an inner conversion or moral uprising, especially one that leads to greater self-awareness or deeper solidarity with the oppressed or marginalized. They much prefer a host who is content enough to make for themselves an acceptable life without ever realizing what it means to live to the full, to exist, but never to thrive, to be just content enough, busy enough, distracted enough, or sedentary enough to do nothing in the face of evil. While most of us will never be counted among the infamous tyrants or conspicuous villains of history, the only moral climate these demons need to flourish is one that renders us extraordinarily mediocre. Let us pray. Save us from the evil one, and do not put us to the test. May we be forgiving, aware as we are of your boundless forgiveness. Give us today the bread that sustains us. On earth as in heaven, may your will be done. May your kingdom come, O Holy One and Father of all. Amen. So as always, I invite your thoughts, or comments, or reflections on the readings today. Of course, we're in the middle of describing the distinctions between the so-called renegade and parasitic demons. In this part of the book, trying to distinguish how they sort of operate within us, as it were. So you have the floor.
Um,
Sorry, Kathy, go right ahead. I'm sorry, I was muted there. Go right ahead. Good morning.
um, this pandemic period and the sort of racial awakening that started with George Floyd's death really plunged me into starting to look at all the ways that I've been asleep in my life with regard to the things that the parasitic demon had a hold of me for. And so I did, and I was in a study group with my Tucson church for over a year, reading quite intensely on particularly on the racial issues, and starting to become aware of how I've been very much living in the oppressor kind of life very unknowingly. And so I did then join with a nationwide African-American led group to become more politically and socially active in the ways that I could during these pandemic times. But what I, and that was also helpful in helping to wake me up. But what I discovered is with each new request for help, and granted, the work that I did was pretty limited given the pandemic restrictions, but it still took a lot of effort. But with each call, then my exhaustion just got more and more and more. And so I'm wondering if, as we wake up to the hold that the parasitic demons have on us, as we try and claim a more active life, a more engaged life towards trying to create more of a God's kingdom here on this earth plane, if we're going to be struggling like Jacob with the angels or something, except we're struggling with these demons that might be grabbing a hold of us as we do try and make these changes.
Right, Kathy. For a brief moment there, you you broke up a bit. So you were asking, if I could just come to the heart of your question, you're saying, like Jacob struggling with the angel, but we're struggling in a sense with these demons. Yes. But then I missed the question part of that.
So as we try and wake up to the ways that the parasitic demons have a hold of us, like me starting to engage more, to actually take more responsible action and engagement with these, the ways that the parasitic demon had me sleep, I found myself being more and more exhausted. So in this journey to wake up to the parasitic demon and do that transformation, is this part of the journey? Or, I mean, I just don't know how to be with this because it's very frustrating.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. So to help with context, as you probably all know now, what the real heart of this chapter is really about a reclamation of a kind of Christian ascesis or Christian asceticism for the modern contemplative, which asks what really is the role of asceticism in the life of the contemplative, and what does that look like? And the struggle that you describe, Kathy, is, I think, precisely the struggle that we find ourselves all entering into, sometimes even reluctantly, because we realize there is such a great need that we're sometimes even afraid to begin that first step of engaging socially or ecologically or, around our discipleship, because there's really no end to what could be called upon us to do, to help ameliorate and so on. And we get that sense of that being completely exhausted and overwhelmed. We've probably all heard the term compassion fatigue bantered around in the last several years. And it's a real thing. So what I'm going to move to at the very end of this chapter are three sort of ways of approaching asceticism that help us see what I think are major, in broad strokes, sort of distinctions. There's ways in which we act toward those we know and love, our neighbor, people we really are connected to. There's ways in which we act toward people we don't know, right? A kind of impersonal love, somebody in a state I've never met. What does it mean to love indiscriminately people I've never met? And then finally, the idea of vigil keeping is around precisely the sense of how to be with the powerlessness that we often have in the face of such overwhelming need and suffering. So in each of those is a kind of expanding you have to take those three things, what we can do locally, what it means to live globally, to put it that way, and then what it means to live with the powerlessness of not being able to transform the world in the way we would hope it would be in any number of ways. And so the two poles that I caution against is the paralysis that comes from feeling like I can't do everything. And then in some ways, the hubris that comes from feeling I have to do everything, and then somehow finding that middle ground. So the way I always summarize that is you can't do nothing, you can't do everything, but you have to do something. So the trick is in our contemplative life is to negotiating what that something is. And when we see that not merely as some activity I'm being called to do, but really an extension of who I am in the world, I think the process of the contemplative life, or the fruits of the contemplative life, are most valuable there, because the first question is, who is Kathy in the world? And by which I mean, how does the Christ light uniquely get filtered through the prism that is you, right? This is the big question. What unique gifts, what limitations, what passions, what talents does that love get filtered through that makes you unique? And this is really Paul's question of, do you not know you are members of Christ's body? Are you an eye, an ear, a hand, a foot, and so on? So I think the idea comes down to, if you want to use the idea of what color of the rainbow am I, or what part of the body am I, that's the first question we have to ask as contemplatives, rather than necessarily just look at endless needs. that is exhausting and paralyzing and frankly depressing. But really start with the question, who am I? And then once I know who I am, and as I discover who I am, I allow the Christ light to shine through me in that particular way. That means also, as I say, I think somewhere in this chapter, that real humility is the ability to see the truth and admit it. That means also seeing what I'm not, what I can't do, where my limitations really are, for any number of reasons. So as we come to that self-knowing, contemplative action flows from that. It isn't something separate or isolated. And that is what's so important, I think, around this question of what can I do and what can't I do? And to understand then that as a member of the global community, the Christian community, what I am doing is not in isolation. If I'm an eye and I'm seeing, I have to trust that there are ears out there hearing, and there are noses out there smelling, and there are hands out there holding, to know that they're doing their part and I'm doing mine. And there comes both then a greater awareness of not only my own deification, but also that Christ is all and is in all. So I allow myself to be a part of the body and not take on that exhausting sense that I am the body per se. And I think that is a constant process of interior negotiation. New situations may arise, like what happened in your condo complex, becomes something you can do that nobody else on this call, for example, in this community can really do, for all the reasons that are obvious, your location and who you know as neighbors and all your personal investment in that. But there is something that, several months ago, you really talked about your own sense of responding to that rather than running, but to collaborating. That's a beautiful example of something you can do within the context of these global crises. And I think what happens then is that to do this in community, particularly in contemplative community, where we're all doing the work of coming to deeper self-awareness, deeper Christ consciousness, openness to ourselves as deified members of Christ's body, the encouragement comes when I realize I don't have to do it all, and that my neighbor is doing that, and this community member is doing something else. And there's kind of a mosaic that begins to get constructed around that, and each of us is just a tile in that. And I think that's so important for our own spiritual and mental health. I mean, when we look to the Gospels and Jesus is saying, hey, I need to move on from this village because there's another village that needs to hear this message. No doubt he left behind. I mean, we hear about the stories of the blind and the lame and the sick that he cured, but no doubt he left behind others who he didn't attend to and couldn't attend to because there was another pressing need that he had to respond to, right? So the big question is the people that Jesus touched and healed is a far smaller subset than those he wasn't able to get to in the world during his brief 2 years. And we have to accept that as part of the limitations of being human, and to understand that what we do has also the capacity to reverberate, to plant seeds that others then can pick up with and run with. I see that a lot as a teacher. I'm always delighted. I've been teaching long enough now to have former students who have children, and to see the choices that they've made, and to realize, when they write to me 20 years later, that some seed I planted took off in their life, and they're often doing this amazing thing that I didn't even know about. So there's a way in which there's also that deep sense of reverberation and inspiration that grows out of what we do. So there is, I'm discovering now in our commitment to ecological issues and meeting with a small committee around this, one of the things I really want to draw upon for St. Columba's and our members is the urgency of doing something, but also the urgency of keeping that grounded in our practice so that we don't get to that place of paralysis and exhaustion and fatigue.
Thank you.
We have to be gentle with ourselves. We can't, as much as it pains us, we can't fix the world, but we can address the suffering. Yeah. So I hope that helps, Kathy, give you
Yes, it does. Thank
encouragement.
you.
All right, good. Okay. Let's see then, Dave, please. I think you were next.
I think I've been too gentle on myself. And thank you, Kathy, for putting this in the context of being asleep. and I praise my gradual awakening. Um, and I'm reminded of that verse, "Awake, O sleeper,"
Mm.
and my daily prayers always include Psalms at some point, and those Psalms which are happily, the most frequent in praise of God, in praise of the Creator, in praise and thanksgiving for what He has done for the Israelites. I love those, and they lead me into more praise of God. Then I encounter the ones in which they're calling upon God to strike their enemies. And until recently, I found myself skipping over those. My frame of reference was not that I'm among a bunch of enemies, and they seemed overly nasty and all of that. And when I awakened to the degree of realizing that those are the very enemies that we've been talking about for the last few weeks, and this being my third trip through this chapter, which I dearly love, as I began to realize that the enemies that I can pay attention to are those hidden ones within myself. And it has allowed me now to appreciate all of the Psalms, no matter what they are. So that, a subtle benefit that just I really became aware of within the last month or two. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. And it's interesting you discovered that. It's lovely because in a way, the early church struggled with that same question. How do we Christians who are so deeply formed by the gospel of peace and love and healing and reconciliation continue to pray psalms that can be so apparently vindictive? And what they did is exactly what you're saying, is they realized that the external battles we fight are reflections of the interior battles that we don't fight. That it's almost become a psychological truism today that if you don't do that inner work of dealing with your demons, you're bound to project them onto someone else and objectify them. So that so many of the Psalms, as which have informed Christian contemplatives from the beginning, and therefore are a central piece of a prayer book for Christian contemplatives, is to learn how to look at those Psalms in ways that indeed bear the kind of fruit you're talking about. And the enemy within is indeed the biggest enemy we all need to be concerned about, whether they're renegades or parasites. They mean business. And there's a way in which seeing and recognizing, being able to name them in the Psalms is so important, I think, for our own spiritual well-being. Because on the one hand, what it does is it says, even though I experience that, I am not that. That is a second moment. That is not central to who I am, right? That is a spiritual reality under which I am under some kind of assault, or which is separate, but that it affirms the deepest identity that Christianity wants to insist upon, which is, and Judaism for that matter, which is that first and foremost, I am good, right? God saw that it was good. And those things we struggle with are only a second moment, right, in creation. So it's a beautiful way to really understand a spiritual, or what we sometimes call a Christological reading of the Psalms, where we read them through the lens of Christ, and how that transforms their meaning for us in very important ways. So thank you for raising that. It's very important, Dave. Nice that you came to that, what seems to be independently, even when the tradition has thought of that. That's tells me something about tapping into some universal truth there.
Yeah, which the reading that you did after our reflection was just me. You're describing me. Thank
Yeah,
you.
well, and it's a lot of autobiography as well. That's where most of this chapter comes from. So yeah. Thank you, Dave. Let's see then. Ruth, please.
this is more an observation than a question. When I first read this chapter, it was in one of those frustrating periods in my centering prayer practice. And oftentimes when I hit a frustrating period, I will revisit my mindfulness learning and pull techniques from that. And I was dealing with monkey mind. And, one of the strategies I had learned was just name it and let it go. And reading this chapter, instead of naming it, I labeled it renegade, parasite, renegade, parasite. If I didn't know, it was just a question mark and I let it go. And I had a very unexpected awareness from that experience. I'll put it in context of the environmental movement because that's one of your focuses right now. I also often found myself in prayer doing things like, you're not good enough. You have ideas, you're a butterfly mind, the idea emerges, you want to let it go and let somebody else do it. You can't renegade. The other side of it was the planning. This is what I'm going to do. This is the good stuff I'm going to do. And this was going on in centering prayer, parasite. And I realized, because really the biggest context was realizing that so many of my monkey mind thoughts in centering prayer were about what I could do to better focus in centering prayer, and to realize that parasites could come in such insidious clothing just has blown me away. And it's a practice that I continue. It's like I'll be with my grandkids and their friends, and we'll have this wonderful little environmental activity planned in the garden. We do lots and lots of gardening. And I get so caught up in their joy that I forget the activity, parasite. And it has really been a good awareness to realize, their joy isn't the parasite. It is my getting so wrapped up in it that I lose the rest of the plan. It is my getting so wrapped up in the planning that I don't do the action. And that is what I gained from reading this first part of this chapter, because that awareness of that pattern in myself has been so helpful to get me off of the stop thinking about what you can do. Just do something. Just do something.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ruth. Really well said. And that, that can indeed become a tactic to stop us, slow us down, keep us from really taking that first step. And if it's easier to think of it this way, just the way our prayer life and really our interior life is so much about getting out of the way Meister Eckhart, who talks about, spirituality is not about addition, but subtraction. It's about removing the obstacles that prevent intimacy, rather than thinking I have to do one more rosary, one more devotion, pray one more psalm, etc. It's the whole process is about a negative approach to things, right? Removing things rather than piling things on. And one of the things we realized in terms of even the environmental question is, if we can just find small ways to begin extracting ourselves, not continuing the problem, right? Shifting the way we are in the world in a way that removes us from being part of the problem, what products we stop using and so forth, right? That are contributing to pollution or to plastic buildup in our oceans. That retraction is sometimes easier than, as a starting point, than knowing what to do that is, let's say, positive. So just to hold that in mind, that it can often be the simplest things, the slightest choices, and they tend then to build on each other, because once you've got that down, right, that whole pattern of removing myself from being a contributor to the world's problems, then you can start building on that foundation to being, to in a sense, contributing something, say, in a positive sense, rather than just what you don't do. And the moment we get too chatty about it, we should just call that out as the very thing, the very mechanism that, say, the parasites are using to keep us complacent, to keep us not acting. It just all gets caught up here. Just do it. To use that Nike phrase, hate to say that, but yeah, it's sort of, you just begin. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that beautiful insight. Let's see, Christine, please.
Yeah, as I listen to what you're saying, it seems to me that as we do the inner work, as we wrestle with renegades and parasites, we find ourselves on the continuum, and we know ourselves to be not only the victim, but the perpetrator. And when we do that, that whole polarity collapses and we're humbled. And so the more we do this work, the more clear our eyes are to see, so that we don't have to worry about what we should do. It will come to us. Is this right? I mean, I think this is the benefit of doing the inner work, that then we can see and we see the opportunity when it comes and it fits who we are.
Yeah.
I don't have to go out and do the work to figure. Does that make sense?
Sorry, Christine, repeat that last thing. I accidentally cut you off. I don't have to go out and do the work.
I don't have to figure out what I have to do so much as just realize it. It happens because I have eyes to see and heart to know.
That's right.
In the moment.
There is a Buddhist proverb that says, that draws the connection between wisdom and compassion. And the idea is that the truly wise understand the interconnectedness of all things. And once you know that, once you have eyes to see that, to use your term or to use Christ's term, once you have that wisdom and realize we're all connected, then it simply stops making sense to brutalize another person, to treat someone unjustly, to cause harm in the world, because you realize it's harm you're causing to yourself ultimately. So that compassion grows of wisdom, because real wisdom is what helps us, opens our eyes to see the unity of all things, and therefore the nonsensical nature of harming anything else that I would perceive as other. And I think that is indeed partly what's at the stake of Paul's analogy of the body and so on, is we are extensions of one another. Matthew 25, that beautiful parable about the sheep and the goats really does show, if I'm to realize or to awaken to myself as an embodiment of Christ in the world, that is part and parcel of realizing that others are the same. When did you do this? Whenever you did it to the least of my sisters and brothers. That's when we did it to you, O Lord, right? So there's this connection there. So contemplative insight, awakening, wisdom, inevitably leads to compassion, because it inevitably leads to the sense of unity of all things. And from that awakened place, or continually awakening place, the compassion, I think, continues to grow, because the things that I do when I'm not awake, under the false assumption that of this separation, become less and less tenable, less and less possible. And I don't want to suggest that, therefore, we should just meditate for the next 20 years to figure out, to come to that wisdom. But these two things very much go part and parcel. You know full well when you're turning a blind eye to something. You know full well when you can't see something, because to really look at it would prevent you from doing what you're doing right now. It's really an important piece to remember. And at least for me, I've become more and more aware of what it means to live with a kind of peripheral vision, and then have my contemplative sort of practice continue to pry that open, even sometimes against, my own desire, because sometimes I don't want to look because that would make my life too difficult, or because that would say I have to change this or that behavior, because I would have to acknowledge the suffering that it's causing someone or something, right? So these are the ways, though, in which a real honest assessment of sort of where we choose to put on blinders and how the contemplative life pries those away, if we're really being honest. Once that happens, the action flows. It just does. And a lot of it flows by, again, what I said earlier about what I start not doing in the world, what I refrain from doing in the world because of that. Right? If I keep up this action, this group of people or these animals or this are being harmed, I can't be authentic and keep doing that. Right. So it's a tough, the contemplative life is tough in that way because it doesn't let anybody off the hook if you're doing the work. But this is where, what I'll talk about at the very end of the chapter of keeping vigil is so important, because you also come up against what you're powerless to change. And the ability to be with that suffering and allow our hearts to break, as I've said, is so important to keeping us compassionate and supple and open, because the only alternative is a heart that's fortressed and calloused and jaded. And that's where we become more part of the problem than the solution, when we allow our hearts to just harden to that suffering. Thanks, Christine. It's a beautiful insight. Let's see, Dave, good morning.
Morning. A couple images, primarily in response to Kathy's feeling overwhelmed. It brought to remembrance a word in that marvelous book by Thomas Kelly, The Testament of Devotion, when he says, "We do not have to die on every cross, nor are we required to." We do not have to die on every cross, nor are we required to, which puts us in the land of discernment. And that leads me to one other little image. When I retired for the first time in 2005, people said, "What are you going to do?" And I borrowed a phrase from Isaiah 49. I said, "I'm going to be a polished arrow in God's quiver and see where it lands." And that sense of discernment about where, if I'm going to be a polished arrow, then Lord, show me where that should land, because I don't have to die on every cross. Where is it that you want that to land? That's part of the discernment process. So just those two images, and I wanted to share.
Both very welcome, David. Thank you for that. Yeah, that really does, the image of not dying on every cross, I think, speaks to the heart of exactly what it is I'm trying to also get at, that we are in a particular context and location. We have a particular set of gifts. The question is, how do we hone that arrow, right? So that the particular gifts and things that I offer shape that arrow, shape its direction. And again, the arrow sort of becomes passive under the skill of the archer. And that brings home how the contemplative life, as I've said in the past, is learning to actively become passive, which means to place ourselves into the hands of the archer who knows how to aim that arrow where it needs to go. So there's a desire. So that letting go is not only a letting go of trying to die on every cross, but it's also a letting go of the things that would otherwise fight against the archer who wants us, aimed in a certain direction, right? So it's a wonderful imagery, and you see that interplay between the letting go within our prayer and that leading to real action and outside of prayer. Thank you, Dave. Robert, let's take your question, and then maybe we can move to some discussion on practice.
Two quick things that are interrelated, I think. The first one is what Kathy said. It takes me back to my days when I was teaching MBAs. One of my clients was Lloyd's of London. And I remember the training manager asking me after a particularly long liquid lunch, have I ever been affected by prejudice? And I thought about it for a while and I said, yes. And I wish I were a better person. A dear friend of mine once said that there is no shame in having a problem. The shame is in not dealing with it. So when I can recognize where I am prejudiced or where I'm going wrong, then I have the wonderful opportunity to do something about it. So I should not flagellate myself for saying I'm prejudiced. I need to deal with that prejudice. That's where the work is. And the second thing, that prayer, give us this day our daily sustenance, takes me to something, to a question, what is the fuel that these demons use? What fuels them? And one of the things I'm beginning to think of is the fuel is money. That because this whole need for me to have more and more money is what is destroying this planet. It's what destroys relationships. The prayer didn't say, give us this day our daily bread and a silo into which I can put my wheat stocks. The manna that was given was not for, eternity or for till retirement. It was for one day or for two on the Sabbath. And I'm beginning to believe that the latter day demons are being fed, nourished by my demand and my desire for more and more money. That's a problem. And having recognized it, maybe I can do something about it. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for your comments. Yeah, just by way of a response to that, I think you've nailed it in terms of the question of being aware of it. There's that line in John, that basically says, God is light, and in God there's no room for darkness. But there's this sort of, if I can paraphrase, what follows is the idea that if you don't acknowledge that you have sinned, then you're a liar, and that there can be no room for light in you, and so there is no shame in acknowledging my shortfallings, my prejudices, or my sin, my transgressions, however I want to think of that, because it's a fact, of being human, and we're caught up in things sometimes before we even know it. What I talk about in terms of intimate community is precisely the place where we feel safe and able to acknowledge that openly, because it's precisely in naming it that you begin to get the power over it. This is something we'll even address in this book. This is why in Christian rite of exorcisms, the priest always has to get the name of the demon. I mean, there's something so archetypally truthful about that. You have to name the demon to have control over it. And the thing about the parasites is they're, unlike the renegades, which seem apparent to the world because they have this sort of, way of just ravaging a human life. The parasites are much more dangerous because they can go for a lifetime completely unnoticed, completely unnamed, completely unacknowledged, and thereby doing all of its subtle work in us with this very comfortable, cozy relationship alongside our virtues and the way we like to project ourselves in the world and all of that. So this task of acknowledging, of seeing, of admitting something truly is the first step. I mean, we see this, within the 12-step program. The first step is admitting it. And this is universally true of all that we struggle with. And it's such a truism that it should almost be easy by now, but there's so much shame associated, right? And so much social judgment associated that we tend to want to sublimate and hide and repress, especially in what I think is an absolutely dangerous trend right now of cancel culture, which I think is just such an aberration of, nobody's allowed a conversion anymore. Nobody's allowed to make even the simplest mistake without being canceled by society. It's like a liberal McCarthyism. I mean, it's gotten ridiculous how there's no room. Everybody's so angry. There's no room for somebody to be imperfect and to find a community who's able to lift them up and say, okay, you screwed up, but You want to repent of that? You want to change your life? Then let's work on that together. And that is the role of intimate spiritual community, not judgment of, oh, look what you did. Oh, look at this prejudice you hold, and I don't have that problem, right? Again, many faces to the demon, but one tail. And that humble acknowledgement that what you struggle with and what I struggle with may look different, but have the same source, right? That's where the humility of intimate community can become supportive and loving, and really a radical affront against this cancel culture. I mean, for what it's worth, this is why Christianity has been so, or at least the factions of Christianity that I've always been a part of, have been so dead set against the death penalty. It's not that there isn't an acknowledgement of heinous crimes, unspeakable crimes, but if you take someone's life, you thwart the capacity for repentance. And that Christian optimism that forever holds out hope of repentance is so key to all of this. And when you simply kill someone by the state, well, what if 5 years from now, they would have come to a different moment and really have understood and accepted and repented for this thing, or whatever it is, right? Cancel culture does the same thing. It socially sort of annihilates a person without any hope or room for some form of change of heart, which is the core of the gospel: metanoia, conversion, right? Repent, return to me. So we have to forgive ourselves. We have to be able to forgive others. Of course, that other has to want that forgiveness, right? We have to see that repentance, that change of heart. But we can't have a culture that thwarts the possibility. Or what do we have? I mean, who among us can throw that first stone? This is very important. So what you're naming, Robert, is so central, I think, to both the value of intimate community, where I can say, I'm prejudiced. I hold these things and I hate that about myself. And I don't even know where it came from. I absorbed it from my culture or society, but I see it and I refuse to act on it. And so how can this intimate community help me acknowledge and move past, just to use that example, right? So this is so important, what you're naming. And this is what makes, I think, authentic Christian community different from just a social club where we meet for an hour on a Sunday and go home. Right. So thank you, Robert. I really appreciate that. I think you really nailed it. Yeah. Francis, go right ahead.
The shares this morning have been so rich, which actually is normal. I think it would, I have so many thoughts going in every direction. I think the first one is judge not lest you be judged. All of us are, and this is a global statement, all of us are racist. All of us are bullies. All of us are sinners. All of us are imperfect. And it is so easy for us to think, well, I don't really, I'm not a bully. I didn't, beat kids up when I was little. Most of us don't take bullying to that degree. But all of us, like any of us who have siblings, at some point, like, shove them out of the way. It's human nature. All of us are brought up in and reinforced by culture, but I think it's human nature to try to make sense of the world, and thus we categorize and we notice differences, and so we notice us versus them, me versus you, which becomes us versus them, which becomes the grounds on which, well, if there's only one cookie, who gets it? Well, I do. My sister doesn't. So, and being able to name that demon and be like, maybe that's not entirely fair. Maybe we can break the cookie in half. And that little kid inside us going, but I want the whole thing. When we get holier than thou and we pretend that we are perfect in some fashion, that we, just naturally love everybody, that we are, that we hold too closely the need to see ourselves as a nice person. Who doesn't want to see themselves as a nice person? But if you're holding on tightly to that idea, then it's harder to see the ways in which you might not have been so nice. And I think that, Vincent, I think you're so right in that we need to be able to hold each other with that tenderness of, yeah, you know what? Even if I didn't sock my classmates in the nose and steal their lunch money, did I always include them? No. Did I share what I could have? No. Did I, all those opportunities where we could have been better, we've all done them. We do them continually. But when we hold on to that need of our fragile egos, which we all have, I know I do, and when we're surrounded by a cancel culture of, well, if you do one thing wrong, if we catch you, you'll be judged and canceled. If we decide you've done something wrong, how can any of us learn and grow? None of us is perfect. We're all broken. We're all struggling when we ultimately are honest with ourselves. And when we create a community, a box, a container for us to go, how can I do that a little bit better? Did I go to the Palace Market yesterday, and I had actually just been interacting with some people and speaking Spanish with them. And a woman who was wearing a Palace Market, she clearly worked there. She was wearing the whatever it was that I interacted with her, and I automatically switched to Spanish. And you know what? Honestly, that's racist. I had no basis on which to know whether or not she spoke Spanish other than the way she looked. That's racism. It's an assumption based on what someone looks like. And it turned out to be an accurate assumption, but it was presumptuous of me to assume, and it was, I was going from one thing to another, and I had just been speaking Spanish, but it still really honestly was racist, not in a horrible way, but in a minor way. And whether or not it was offensive to her, I don't know. But afterwards I was thinking about it, I was like, because I've actually I went into a burrito place a couple of months ago, and a Hispanic came in to order, and there was a Hispanic behind the counter, and the Hispanic behind the counter started speaking Spanish to the customer, and the customer said, "I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish." And talk about a weird twist on what amounts to racism, assuming that someone has a certain set of whatever based on what they look like. And it was just like, wow, that was really interesting. And they probably get it all the time, honestly. But I'm rambling.
Let me just point out, I think too, I just want to ease you up a little bit. I think too, when we live in a multicultural context, one could be forgiven for making mistakes like that. And I think that it was a lovely thing that you did. I just want to affirm that, because while you may have been making a set of assumptions based on appearance, right? I know the context you're talking about, and I don't think it's like completely out of orbit for you to have made that assumption. from where we live. But I understand the context of what you're saying, and how we kind of can often make these assumptions about people based on appearance, and sometimes to our great embarrassment. What I always look for in an individual is the intention behind it. And I think in our culture, we don't consider enough intention. We look almost too much at the outward action and judge it right or wrong or good or bad or whatever. But what about the intention behind it? And what your intention was, I think, should be part of the equation. And I know you enough to know that your intention was kind and compassionate and connecting, and not trying to be anything but that.
But going to the demons, it's so easy for us to be complacent and not realize, not see ourselves.
Right.
And so that's where it becomes sort of a sticky wicket.
Right.
Is we don't want to see our own. I mean, that example of my being mildly racist is so mild. We don't want to see that, yes, we are, to some degree, probably all guilty in every category that we judge other people in.
That's one of the bases for, I think, being an intimate community that doesn't judge, because there's few things I can accuse anybody here of doing that to some capacity I haven't done myself, right, in some context. So thank you for, I do want to move us on, because I want to talk about our practice, but thank you, Francis, for sharing that. And I do know your heart to know where that was coming from, but I thank you for that. Let me take a look here then at our practice for this week, and then I'd like to see if anybody took me up on my challenge for this past week. So for today, up and coming, and by the way, I've already sent these to Joanne, so she has or will send this all out to you soon. But the practice this week is to attend to any one aspect of your life in which being content with mediocrity masks a deeper complacency. So of course, this exercise is directed at your parasites, as it were. And I'm just asking you to look at what lies beneath. In some ways, it comes out of Francis's own comments just now about how subtle these things can be, and our need to kind of look at that in a very careful way. So attend to any one aspect of your life in which being content with mediocrity masks a deeper complacency. So how kind of this desire for complacency keeps you mediocre, or as I say in the book, extraordinarily mediocre, not someone who acts or responds, but who just kind of holds the stasis. And then ask yourself what lies beneath that deep mediocrity or that deep complacency, right? Kind of a challenge, but asking you to really get to the heart of what these two paragraphs talk about. For last week, I asked us this then. This week's practice, practice loving kindness or forgiveness for a person whose own unresolved struggle with their demons has hurt you, and what begins to shift in you. This, of course, comes back to the prayer that I've offered today, the Our Father, in both directions. What does it mean? You know, what some have called the dangerous prayer, by which we ask God to forgive us to the extent that we forgive others. So this is really trying to help you look at how another's actions that can be hurtful or offensive, how we find compassion by recognizing that much of that comes from their own unresolved struggle with their own demons. And that really helps us to separate the action from the person, the reactivity from the individual, which in my own life has helped facilitate forgiveness, which is why I'm sort of suggesting this. So I see, so let me stop the share there. I saw something. Okay, were there any takers on this one, this challenge? Robin, go right ahead.
Well, as I looked at my day-to-day existence in light of what you were suggesting, it just seemed to me that the unresolved issues in all of us were everywhere, all the time, and influencing our lives almost constantly. Do you agree?
Yeah, they are. They are. That I think is true. But I do think, Robin, just for the feedback, I'll mute you for a second, but then you certainly unmute as you come back on. Certainly it is true that we are always and everywhere under the assault of this kind of what you're talking about. But I also think that we can start because each of us probably holds a certain predictable pattern, a kind of entrenchment in certain issues, what sometimes we call trigger points, right? Where this is an issue I struggle with all my life because of X, Y, and Z experience or whatever. Abandonment issues, issues that might arise from bullying, issues that are, arise from childhood abuse, whatever those things may be, become kind of entrenched patterns that loom large in how we are in the world, or how we are wounded and how that really hampers our ability to negotiate our world. It isn't to say those other things aren't there, but maybe it's good to start with the big things. I always talk about the idea that starting your spiritual life is like waking up in the morning after a college frat party and your house is decimated with, beer cans and got ashtrays and, bags of chips and everything laying all over it. Sometimes you don't even know where to begin. Like, what do I even start with? Well, the thing is like, start with the biggest items, like get a trash bag and start throwing things away, because you can't really dust the furniture. You're not even going to see the dust on the furniture until the rest of that is cleared up. So you start with the big things, and that helps to clear the way in that inner space for you to see how then the littler things need attending to. But you're right. I mean, that's why in many ways the spiritual life is a never ending sort of movement toward opening and awakening to see the beer cans and the ashtrays and the potato chip bags and the dust. It's sort of all there, right? I don't know. I muted you because it was feedback, but did you want to respond to that, Robin?
Well, just that it enhances my ability to forgive by remembering this at all times in myself and in everyone else. And so I appreciate having the attention brought to that for this last week. Thank you.
Absolutely. And, the way this gets summarized in the gospel is take the log out of your own eyes so you can better see the speck in someone else's. I mean, this is exactly what Jesus was talking about, right? And if we could all learn to do that, we would come at one another with a tremendous dose of humility. And it's only in a culture where people are not doing their own inner demon work that we get to this kind of judgment and it's all based in fear and otherizing and canceling and, think and in self-righteousness. I mean, it's really a cacophony. It's a mess of all these things coming together that would so be softened if we can start with the fact that I have a log in my eye. All right. So thanks, Robin. I'm glad that spoke to you. That's great. Yes, Erlene, good to see you. There you go.
I found this a very humbling experience. If I looked at this person and said, the reason that she hurt me was because of her unresolved struggles within herself. That made me very humble because I know that I have probably hurt somebody else with unresolved problems. And it makes me now want to reach out to her, because we haven't spoken for years, to reach out to her. And I haven't done that yet, but that's what it made me feel that I should, just to see where she is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's all I have.
Erlene, first of all, thank you for that. It's lovely. That's sort of the fruit I had hoped would come out of a meditation like this. So thank you for sharing that. Let me ask, is your intuition such that she would be responsive to you reaching out?
I'm not sure,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like that I have to do that whether she responds or not, because I feel like if I reach out and then it's in her ballpark, it's her decision. And so I have to accept it either way, whichever.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. And I would just intuition. That's one of the practices in our spiritual life that I think is so important, which is that I have an intuition that's born of the fruits of the gospel: love, reconciliation, forgiveness. And then I dampen it. What if she rejects me? There's all kinds of fear. I don't want to be hurt again. I don't want to open myself. And then we understand, forget about it. I'm not going to do it. And that is exactly the dampening of the fire of the gospel that is so prevalent. I mean, I've seen it in my own life, how you have that open intuition, that impulse of love that gets dampened when you overthink it.
Yeah.
So I would want to just say, because you've been so honest about that, two things. I would strongly encourage you to reach out in a way that you feel you can, through a letter, a phone call, an email. And at the same time, let go of the outcome.
Yes.
In other words, be prepared for her to not be responsive. And if that is the case, then to your point, who knows if a year from now, her heart won't soften and you might get a delayed response, right? Or something like this. But if the response is either nothing or worse, negative, again, meditating on the fact that she's dealing with her own demons, as it were, her own struggles, her own woundedness, that it's not personal to you, could help you do the loving thing and be detached from the outcome. So in a sense, you're not hurt again by it. Right. And I would encourage you and follow up with us on that. I'd love to know how that goes for you. And I hope it goes well. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Sure thing. Sure. Other comments about the exercise? It's an important exercise because one of the things that the creation narrative of Genesis insists upon, as I alluded to earlier, is that whenever God creates, God sees that it is good, and that as much as we talk, thank you, Augustine, of original sin, original sin can only be talked about because of the assumption of the less spoken original innocence. So that reclamation of our original innocence is important, even though it only spans about one page of the Bible. It is original, and it is, if you want to say, primeval and central to who we are as human beings. And that is a very fundamentally important affirmation of Christianity, to say that sin is always a second moment, always. That in our core, we are good, we are beautiful, right? We are divine in that sense. And anything we call sin is always a second moment, which means it's not core to our deepest identity. And our ability to acknowledge that about ourselves is the same capacity for us to acknowledge in another person that same truth, right? So and therein lies the log and the speck and the humility that comes with being non-judgmental. Kathy, please, back to
you. Your exercise gave me an opportunity to reflect on something that happened just a couple of weeks ago. I've got, excuse me, 4 sisters and a brother, and one of my sisters, Terry, she's 3.5 years younger. She's a Methodist minister. And 32 years ago, her husband really badly hurt me for 4 nights in a row when I was visiting them. And up to that point, Terry and I, we didn't get to know each other till I was in college, even though there's a short span of years between us. And I found that I have never experienced closeness with a human being like I have with her. But then after this happened with her husband, a huge rift came between us, and it wasn't anything that I initiated. It's just that she needed to be with her husband around all of this. So I've been through decades of grief. And then maybe in the last 10 years, I've been praying a lot about healing this, and I've taken her to therapy. So I've done what I could, but finally I've had to let go. And 2 Christmases ago, I did send her, I felt moved to write her a letter to express my love for her, because the love has never died, even though the grief is there. And I found this artistic little heart-shaped dish and sent it in this package with this letter, just telling her about my love and telling her about something that's very transformational. When I was as her husband was dying, that helped me forgive him, so that I didn't feel like there's anything in my heart that was separating me. But then I knew I had to let go of, and just let God, put it in God's hands as to what happened. Then my sister officiated at my brother's wedding on August 29th. So that was the first time I've seen her since she officiated at our father's memorial service 5 years ago. And so I was very nervous about seeing her. So when I first encountered her, she was cheery, and I sensed a total energy transformation, because I also in the work had realized that there was something in her that was a place of great woundedness that my presence seemed to keep re-triggering. So I knew that was why I had to let go and just let God act on God's own plan. But because I could sense that change of energy in her greeting, eventually, during her week and a half here, I did spend a whole day with her, and it was the most beautiful day in my whole life I have ever spent with her. And it just shows me that sometimes it takes 32 years for something to heal, for enough growth to happen in me and enough transformation that needs to happen. So I thank you for the frame that I could put this in.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Yeah, 32 years is about the length of the life of Christ. So there's something right that's quite beautiful in that.
Wow.
But yeah, indeed, we never know the seeds that we're going to sow, when they're going to sprout and what they'll do. But I think it's always worth it, because the harvest, as you're seeing, that comes back, is profound, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. That's a beautiful witness to exactly the kind of dynamic I'm wanting you to explore. Beautiful. Let's see, Frances.
I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness the past couple of years, and one thing I've noticed is actually kind of what Kathy referred to in her sister, and that is I have gotten better at looking at, like, okay, where's that person coming from, and what's their hurt that may have caused them to act in a way that I'm finding unkind. My biggest challenge remaining, I think, and maybe this is naive of me, but it is the part in me that was hurt. And figuring out, well, bringing not just empathy to the other person, but also bringing empathy to myself. And kind of, there's the forgiveness part, there's a understanding part of why the other person might have done that or been that way. But there's that little part of me that's, the child that's going, but you hurt me. That is that mini trauma or whatever and my needing to address my own, there's that little hook or something there's something that bringing empathy to them doesn't cut it for me. I need to figure out how to deal with my hurt.
Yeah, thanks, Frances. You raise a very good point. I don't know who said it, but I never forgot the saying that forgiveness is the aroma released by the flower when crushed underfoot, which is such a profoundly simple but beautiful. So the part of you that says I'm hurt, that gets crushed by the actions of another person, that forgiveness to give, right, in advance, in a sense of even the healing. I think that the two go hand in hand, that as we come to recognize, oh, wait a minute, it's the person that needs forgiveness, not what they did. What they did is in the past. It doesn't exist anymore. We tend to keep it alive by holding on to grudges or the hurt itself, nursing the hurt, remembering the hurt, and not to diminish the reality that people's actions can be really hurtful, emotionally, psychologically, physically even. But whatever it is, in my own process of learning to forgive deep, wounds, I realized, wait a minute, the thing that they did, the action that I'm holding on to is over. It's done. It's in the past. And I keep casting them or reliving them doing that thing. But in fact, what needs forgiveness is not the action, it's the person. The person is here now in the present with me. They've changed, they've grown, they've moved beyond whatever that thing was. And it's my lack of forgiveness that keeps them trapped in the past of what they're doing. Depending on the depth of the offense, this can be, not a simple solution, right? That some things are wound us deeply, or deep betrayals and so on of trust and love and what have you. But somehow what needs to, I think that the self-healing doesn't necessarily come before we forgive someone else, but they happen in tandem. They almost feed one another. That my ability to attend to the hurt, to try to let it go, to heal from it, can be enhanced by seeing this person who is in need of forgiveness right in front of me now, and who I keep locking into this past that doesn't exist, and to free myself and them from that in order to be present to what is now. And I think somehow that the act of forgiveness can also be the way in which we find healing for ourselves, rather than one being necessarily sequential. So not easy work, as most things in the spiritual life are. It really can be difficult. And especially if the person isn't asking for forgiveness or doesn't seem to have a need for it, this can make it even more difficult, because sometimes what's healing for us is the acknowledgement from another person. Like, I realize I did it wrong. I mean, an apology can go a long way when it's sincere, because at least it's an acknowledgement of the offense by the person who did it. But it's still not impossible to forgive without that. It comes down to looking at the woundedness, looking at the hurt that it caused, and, forgive them. They know not what they do. As Jesus is being crucified on the cross, at least according to Luke, this is among the last things he says. And notice that he's talking about the blindness. They don't understand what they're doing. And this is really what this meditation practice was about. Most of us don't understand the reactivities we have, or the offenses we cause, because we haven't addressed the demons of our discontent that lie beneath them, or our fears. So much offensiveness from one to another comes from places that are blind in us, that we're deaf to, that are dark in us, that are unacknowledged in us. And if you as an individual can begin to recognize that in another person, even where they can't acknowledge it, I think it goes a long way to heal ourselves. Okay. And we need, of course, to be gentle with ourselves where we're having trouble forgiving. That adds another layer of lack of compassion. We have to have compassion for ourselves as we struggle to forgive, right? But to know that with grace, I think it is possible. It's not always easy, but it's possible. So we are just about nearing the hour, and I wish you could all be here at around 10. We're doing our St. Columba's Jumble Sale today. Read flea market. I'm not sure why we're not allowed to call it that, but somebody said it's not a flea market, it's a jumble sale. Maybe there's a difference that I'm unaware of. But anyway, we're having a jumble sale today. So they're actually setting up outside now, and I'll be joining them. But I want to thank you all, first of all, for such a warm and unexpected and kind opening today in celebration of my birthday. It was very, very sweet. I'm a little overwhelmed. So I really appreciate all that love and kindness and thoughtfulness that went into that. And I hope you all have a very lovely and a day ahead and a very lovely week ahead. I may see some of you tomorrow at our service here, but I look forward to seeing you certainly again next Saturday. And until then, I bid you Benum Christinet and send you off in peace and with my blessing in the name of the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. So go in peace and in love, be safe and happy and healthy. And forgive, forgive, forgive. All right, we'll talk to you soon. God bless you now.